Um, I can hear the translation in my. Oh, that's because I'm on the wrong. Okay, good. Thank you. Excuse me. I'd like to. J'aimerais souhaiter la bienvenue à Monsieur.
I'd like to welcome Mr. McLean, who's with us this evening, replacing Mr. Mézières, and Madame Vignola, who is replacing Madame Rosé. Madame May is also with us this evening. I think from the West Coast, if I'm not mistaken. For those of you around the table, you can take off your masks once you are seated when you participate in the meeting. And if you are not seated at the table, pardon me, I would ask you to wear your mask. And certainly when you are up and moving around in the room, please use your mask, wear your mask. We are ready now to get started. It is the second meeting for Madame Vignola and Mr. McLean. The second meeting on this studies on subsidies for fossil fuels. If you are on the screen but you do not have the floor, please mute your mic. And I guess that's about all I have to say to you with respect to that. But I do have two quick questions for the members of the committee. 2 points that should be brought up. I had hoped to have a meeting of the steering committee next Thursday, but it's budget day, and the whips were in agreement not to have any committee meetings that evening. Is that true? Yes. So we cannot meet that evening. And so second, for the study, it has been suggested that we invite the Commissioner for the Environment and Sustainable Development. But it wasn't suggested on the list that were given to the clerk for the study. So I'd ask for your, as an exception, permission to invite the Commissioner to appear in preparation of the study. Do you agree, Ms. Collin? Do you agree?
This is for the fossil fuel subsidy.
Yeah, he'd be a panelist.
Yeah. Do we know, is the Minister either of Finance or of the Environment, are they coming?
We haven't received any confirmation.
Okay. I'm happy to have the Environment of the Commissioner of the Environment appear, and I really hope that the ministers will also appear.
Okay, noted. Okay, so that's pretty much all I have to say before we begin our first panel. And we have with us today from the Canadian Climate Institute, Dale Biggin. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Who was Vice President, Research and Analysis. And from Environmental Defence Canada, we have Julia Levin, Senior Climate and Energy Program Manager. And from Indian Resource Council, Inc., we have Stephen Buffalo, President and Chief Executive Officer. So we'll start with opening statements of 3 minutes, and we'll start with Mr. Bogan. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
Thanks so much. It's Bugin.
Bugin.
But I take all variations with ease, though, so it's all good.
Okay.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to chat about this important issue. I'm going to draw today on a recent report from my colleagues at the Climate Institute, Rachel Sampson, Don Drummond, and Peter Phillips. That paper takes an economic perspective on fossil fuel subsidies. It assesses whether government measures support or hinder Canada's long-term economic growth and a smooth transition for workers and communities, especially in the face of accelerating decarbonization in global markets. Our research moves away from definitions of subsidy and inefficiency. It assesses policy according to 4 criteria: transition consistency, value for money, employment outcomes, and policy fit. 3 specific findings to draw out. 1, the global low-carbon transition is a structural shift, not a temporary shock. While governments can be tempted to insulate businesses, workers, and communities from market change, impacted sectors and regions will ultimately be better off with strategies that help them prepare for and thrive in the emerging low-carbon economy. Second, the fossil fuel sector is no longer the secure source of economic growth and job creation that it once was. Coal, oil, and gas demand will decline globally, though there is uncertainty on the timing and slope of that decline over the next decade. Public investment in long-lived fossil fuel assets now carry more risk and less certain benefits for society, even within the context of current upheaval in energy markets. And third, governments must make tough choices in allocating scarce public funds. Public investment in decarbonizing fossil fuel production could generate less economic benefits than investment in areas that could capture a share of growing transition opportunity markets, such as hydrogen, mining of battery minerals, or low carbon steel production. That takes me to 5 quick recommendations. The first is that public support for oil and gas firms should prioritize pivots to new transition consistent business lines. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage, for example, will have the biggest long-term benefits in carbon removal or in addressing process emissions in heavy industry rather than decarbonizing existing oil and gas production. Second, Canada should maximize scarce public dollars by making public investments complementary to carbon pricing and other regulatory policies, rather than financing company compliance with those measures. For example, improving methane regulations would be a better approach to reducing oil and gas fugitive emissions than funding those reductions via the Enercan Emissions Reductions Fund. Third, Canada should explicitly consider future global and domestic market conditions and the risk of stranded assets in all policy decisions. For example, Export Development Canada should continue to ramp down its exposure to fossil fuel production. Fourth, Canada should focus on mobilizing private investment and sharing risk rather than fully shifting risk from private company to public entities. For example, support cleaning up of orphan oil and gas wells should be temporary and targeted at firms most at risk of bankruptcy. And finally, Canada should prioritize ensuring new policy measures support transition success. For example, the federal carbon capture, utilization, and storage investment tax credit. Then it can move towards more difficult measures, such as phasing out fuel and carbon tax exemptions for agriculture. Thanks so much, and look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bugin. We'll go now to Ms. Levin for 3 minutes.
Thank you for the invitation to participate today. Last month, the world scientists delivered their starkest assessment yet of the frightening future that awaits us if we fail to act on the climate crisis and limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. We know that to avoid catastrophic climate change, we must transition our economies off of fossil fuels in the next decade. We have the solutions to build a clean energy future, and we know that the transition away from fossil fuels will bring far greater energy affordability, security, and better jobs. Today, Environmental Defense released a new report on fossil fuel subsidies. We found that in 2021, the Government of Canada provided at least $8.6 billion to the oil and gas sector through direct subsidies and public financing from Export Development Canada. That's at least $8.6 billion in taxpayer money that went towards making it cheaper to produce and transport the fossil fuels that are destroying our planet in 1 year. For context, that's a similar amount to what was announced in the ERP, which is to be spent over 7 years. Our report also provides the first estimate of public funding for carbon capture, utilization, storage projects in Canada. The Canadian public has spent $5.8 billion since 2000. And collectively, those expensive projects are capturing only 3.5 megatons of carbon per year. That's 0.05% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. And 70% of that captured carbon is actually used for enhanced oil recovery, i.e. more production. Therefore, those huge public subsidies are resulting in more emissions, not less. Oil and gas companies know these dead-end technologies won't make a dent in emissions, but are using them to justify continued and even expanded fossil fuel production. Unfortunately, as evident in the ERP, the government is falling for it. Carbon capture handouts are set to grow exponentially. Despite raking in massive profits, oil and gas companies are asking governments to pay over $50 billion to equip the oil sands with carbon capture and have been lobbying for a carbon capture tax credit. If Minister Freeland goes through with the tax credit next week and makes it available for oil and gas projects, including fossil hydrogen, it would create a significant new fossil fuel subsidy and be difficult to repeal. The most important steps for decarbonizing Canada's economy are increased electrification, wide-scale use of renewable energy, and better energy efficiency. Yet these sectors have received limited government support, a fraction of what oil and gas companies receive. All fossil fuel subsidies are inefficient and must be phased out. And to that end, we are urging the Government of Canada to eliminate all subsidies, public financing, and other fiscal supports provided to the oil and gas sector by the end of this year on the timeline that the IEA has said. And that includes financial support provided through Export Development Canada without any loopholes for gas, fossil hydrogen, or CCUS. And to redirect all of that support to the proven climate solutions, which will do the lion's share of the emissions reductions that are needed, and providing a fair transition for all towards a renewable energy economy. The pathway to zero emissions and a climate-safe future does not include subsidies or public financing for the oil and gas industry. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Levin. We'll go now to Mr. Buffalo from the Indian Resource Council, Inc.
Thank you, Chair and committee members, for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Stephen Buffalo, and I'm the President and CEO of the Indian Resource Council of Canada. Our organization represents over 130 First Nations who have direct interest in the oil and gas industry. Our mandate is to advocate for federal policies that will improve and increase economic development opportunities for the nations and their members. So it is with some concern that I speak with you today. Our organization and our members care deeply about Mother Earth. But many of the things that have been described as fossil fuel subsidies are actual programs and funds that directly support our First Nation communities and our involvement in the sector. This goes to rectifying some of the economic wrongs that have been done to First Nations in the past. Many of them are programs that are good for the environment and are helping us reclaim our reserve lands where we hunt, pick berries, pick medicines, so future generations can enjoy them. And still other initiatives are designed to provide relief to high cost of living of our people, especially those living in rural and remote communities, so that they can have the basic things like heat, electricity, affordable food, access to medical assistance. But because they're involved in the oil and gas, they are considered bad. And I understand some members of the committee want to get rid of these programs, and I can't understand that logic. I can't see how it's consistent with the Truth and Reconciliation, Calls to Action, the United Nations Declaration Rights of Indigenous People, or the Honor of the Crown. When I first looked at what's considered fossil fuel subsidy and what the committee is trying to eliminate, I can't find any official government sources. But I found some reports from NGOs that itemize it, and I'm honestly shocked. One of them is funding for a diesel generation station in Nibinamik First Nation. And the other was Indigenous Services Canada investment in natural gas and diesel projects and electricity, price support for Indigenous community. Honestly, there are no other options other than diesel for a lot of places. I don't think our people deserve, if you do not think our people deserve heat, electricity, and because it comes from oil, then that tells a really bad story about what you think about Indigenous people. I also saw that Trans Mountain, the Coastal GasLink pipelines were on the list because they got loans, not subsidies. And you're probably aware with the Trans Mountain, there are many Indigenous groups that are trying to buy that pipeline from the federal government. The business case is strong. However, it gets divided up. It's going to provide long-term, stable, predictable revenues for our communities. And it's going to help out to be more financially independent and have monies we can spend, which we think is important, other than what the government decides for us, such as the Indian Act in that regime. Same with Coastal GasLink. Just this month, it was announced that 16 of the First Nations along the route have entered into an equity deal to buy up to 10% of the pipeline. They asked the federal government to help out and provide them loans to get them up to 30% ownership. And our government said no, because it's a natural gas pipeline. I don't think I need to remind everyone that the world needs cleaner energy.
Yes.
But one thing that bothers me the most is the funding of the orphan well inactive well reclamation program. It's on the list too. As part of the COVID recovery, the federal government committed $1.7 billion to clean up orphan wells and pipeline facilities.
Thank you, Mr. Buffalo. We're about a minute over time, so we'll have to stop there. But I have a feeling we're going to have an excellent discussion tonight, and everyone will have an opportunity to give their point of view in answer to questions. So we'll start with the first round of the 6-minute round of questions with Mr. Dreeshen for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and welcome to all the witnesses. And certainly I would like to speak to Mr. Buffalo from the Indian Resource Council. I know many people that have or do call your community home, and hockey teams that I've coached, I've played in your arenas. I know of the services you provide for your people. I listen to you, I talk to you, but I don't talk for you. And I think that's really the key issue that we have. I've been on Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, part of the Truth and Reconciliation, Honour of the Crown, UNDRIP, all of these things. We've had discussions with your people. And I think it's so important. We have so many groups, the NGOs, the movie stars, the politicians, the entertainers, and governments all taking their turns speaking on your behalf. We've just heard of the industry altering 2030 emissions reduction plan program that's going to affect all natural resource sectors. It'll affect the land and those activities like agriculture that are just about in your communities helping all of your members. And it's going to affect the way you invest and the profitability of your efforts. I wonder if you could tell us the type of consultations that you had in the development of this plan.
Well, we definitely trying to move forward. And of course, the objective is to eliminate poverty. Canada is blessed with natural resources, and no one in Canada should not have access to clean water, clean housing, better housing, and the social problems that come with being poor. And of course, with the natural resource sector, we're definitely trying to strike a balance of protecting the environment, taking care of greenhouse emissions. We're doing that now in the site rehabilitation program here. We partnered with Alberta. It's very proud. We're very proud of what we've done. But, as far as the consultation in this whole process, I know none of my members from the Indian Resource Council were consulted and even asked questions about this fuel subsidy. So, it begins there.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And of course, I'm just curious, in your experience, how many of the NGOs actually represent the aspirations of Indigenous communities? And are there NGOs that actually whose work has been detrimental to the goals of your communities? And I think you mentioned that you've seen quite a bit of that. But trying to keep things going as far as time is concerned, you did speak of the orphan well cleanup joint program with the province and the federal government, and you're concerned that in everybody's desire to prove that they know more than you do, this is another thing that they believe should be off the list. There's so many things that have been done on orphan wells and things that people have learned. I wonder what type of lessons that you could tell us about, both on the environmental cleanup side and also on the methane reduction side when it comes to orphan wells.
The orphan well program, we were given $113 million in Alberta to clean up the First Nations land. And we achieved over 1,600 wells, pipelines, and facilities. And our start date was 8 months after everyone else. We are the shining star of this program, and we've asked for an extension on it to do more work. As far as the methane emissions into the atmosphere, and this is based on the Alberta Energy Regulation data, out of those 1,600 wells, 933 of them leak methane. That equates to 2.6 million tons of methane per year. So 220 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And that equates to about 250,000 cars off the road. So we are doing our part. We are cleaning up what mess is there. Our reserves aren't getting any bigger. Our land mass isn't getting bigger. Our population is growing. Our demographics are growing. So we have to clean the land. And this is one program we're very proud that we're able to work in partnership not only with the government of Alberta, but industry itself. And it's employed over 250 young First Nations have taken pride in cleaning the land.
Well, thank you. And I know, if you look back in history, it wasn't too many centuries ago that wood and animal fat and dung and so on were the fuels used by all of our ancestors. And there's, of course, billions of people on this planet that still use this for their basic needs. I'm just curious, if there are any groups that you know of that have the compassion and the foresight to speak for those people and or these actions just focused on redesigning the modern Western world to which you are part of it, and you have had certain experiences with that in your nation's lifetime?
Yeah, you mentioned a bit of our history and what has been utilized in the past. And of course, as time evolved, so has technology. And, when I see fishermen in Musqueam coming into shore, they're not paddling. It's too big, heavy, high-powered boats. And that's for efficiency. When some of our people are out still trapping, they're using a powered snowmobile or four-wheeler. And again, it's for efficiency. And these are things that we just had to adjust with. And as far as I can tell, I've never met a First Nation who proudly declares that an ENGO speaks on their behalf in regards to this space. The leaderships of each community really make their decisions, as to what's best for their people because of the system we live in. We talk about this direction, but we never talk about the Indian Act and what it's done to us. And there hasn't been a federal party yet to really step up and help us eliminate that. Not the Conservatives, not the Liberals, nor the Green Party, nor the Bloc.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Buffalo. We'll go now to Ms. Taylor-Roy for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here, to our witnesses for your introductory remarks. I'd like to start with Mr. Bugan from the Canadian Climate Institute. I was actually pleased to see in your background, Mr. Bugan, that you're an expert in both environmental policy and economics and in balancing the two. And I think your remarks actually reflected that, because I think we all know how important it is to be sure that with our environmental policies, that we are also ensuring that there is economic growth, or there is a place for you're supporting our economy. And I was just wondering, in the 2021 mandate letter to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, it instructed Minister Freeland to work with the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and with the Minister of Natural Resources to accelerate our G20 commitment to eliminate fossil fuels from 2025 to 2023. And do you believe that Canada can meet that target while maintaining a strong economy? And secondly, do you think it's the right time to do it? Because we're in obviously a transition and it's a challenging time. Do you think that's possible?
Just a clarification, please, member. Are we talking the target of achieving emissions reductions or the target of phasing out fossil fuel subsidies?
Phasing out fossil fuel subsidies.
Yeah, I think my remarks suggest that, in fact, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies in lots of cases can support economic growth, and that prudent management of public funds is a key part of long-term prosperity. And in the face of global transitions, in the face of big shifts in international markets, 90% of global GDP has committed to achieving net zero. If they follow through on those commitments, that represents a seismic shift in demand for fossil fuel products and absolutely changes the long-term payoffs of investments, both public and private, in the sector. And in terms of sustaining economic growth and prudently managing public dollars, phasing out that support makes economic sense as much as environmental sense.
Okay, thank you. So basically, it sounds like you're saying that this shift is going to happen regardless of what we're doing. So actually, we're actually just taking funds from one area and putting them to something that would be more productive, because that fundamental shift is going to happen in any event.
And we'll get better return on public dollars in other areas.
Very good. Thank you so much. And Mr. Buffalo, I had a question for you as well. I was very interested in your remarks and the perspective you're bringing, and I thank you for being here representing First Nations. As Mr. Dreeshen said in his introductory remarks, that we can't speak for First Nations. We can't represent you. We have to work with you. And we have heard from other representatives of First Nations that don't share your view, that have a different perspective on fossil fuel, the industry, and what should be done. So would you agree that there's a great diversity of views within First Nations regarding fossil fuel development?
Absolutely, but that comes with a lot of capacity or lack thereof in understanding. Of course, when you start putting science behind money and money behind science, you're going to have polarized views. And of course, when we talk about public money, that's all money that was generated from somewhere. And right now, we're seeing a government that just opens a tickle trunk and they pull out this money to support certain things. But the polarization is definitely there, only because I know we lack a lot of capacity in certain areas and in misinformation. And of course, when it's only one-sided, when the government is only allowed to say one thing about certain issues, then without a balanced consultation, like I said, none of our members were ever consulted in this, and then you might have spoke to to nations or people that support fully, shutting down this sector, but it's provided so much for us.
Right. So are you saying that the First Nations representatives who are for shutting down the sector are do not know what they're talking about?
No, not at all. I'm just saying that they haven't heard the side of what the oil and gas sector provides.
Why do you think that is?
Why do you think that is? Well, again, there's a lot of messaging that isn't clear and it isn't given properly in information. Right now we have teachers telling us that the oil sands are bad, when actually the revenue it provides and the jobs that they provide is still a good thing. And the carbon capture, it might not meet everything that you're looking for today, but it's getting close. And I'm betting on the future generations to fix that for us.
Okay, thank you. And you did mention also that yourself as well in the group that you represent, that you have a lot of concern for Mother Earth and for the environment. And you did mention that there were some projects that you feel are good for the environment. I was wondering if you could give me an example of a program in the fossil fuel sector that you feel is good for the environment.
Very quickly, please. We have 25 seconds, but there's plenty of time for an example or two.
Well, if there's the First Nations that invested in as an owner of say, for example, the Coastal GasLink, that's revenue that isn't governed under a communist system of the Indian Act. That's what it brings. That's the positive it brings. Like, we're so far behind in this, we're not included in these discussions, and you only include the ones that really agree with what you're saying.
Okay, thank you.
That's part of the problem.
Thank you.
I'm glad you're here today then. Thank you.
La parole maintenant est à vous, Madame Vignola, pour 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Madame Levin, lors de votre comparution au Comité des ressources naturelles au cours du dernier mois, vous avez déclaré que même en utilisant le captage et le stockage du carbone, nous ne pouvons...
Carbon capture and stockage. Is there any translation? Yes, it's working. Yes, begin, Madame Vignola, please. Ms. Levin, during your appearance at the National Resources Committee last month, you said that by using carbon capture and stockage, there would be 3.9% of the carbon that is produced throughout the world that would be affected. But we have heard that this would not be in the toolbox for 2030, and we know that there would not be a solution before 2030. This week, there is a budget that is coming, and we hope that there will be tax credits in that. Mr. Wilkinson has made comments about that. Do you think that can you comment on Mr. Wilkinson's comments? If you could, in 2 minutes, comment on what Mr. Wilkinson has said.
Mr. Wilkinson has said various things about CCUS. In the past, he's gone on record saying that, carbon capture and storage won't be part of the 2030 toolkit just because of the timelines that's required to design and build these projects. And yet he put forth a plan which banks heavily on CCUS to do a lot of the lifting in terms of emissions reductions. Similar comments have been made in the past by Minister Guilbeault that certainly CCUS doesn't have a role to play in 2030. So I would point out that discrepancy. I would also say that it's just very risky to gamble on an unproven speculative technology to do a lot of the emissions reductions that we're expecting to happen before 2030. In terms of global capacity, I spoke to Canada's capacity where we're capturing less than 0.05% of our emissions, and most of that is actually going for enhance oil recovery, but globally, I mean, this is a technology that's existed for 30, 40 years, been heavily subsidized for that same time frame, and we're still only capturing less than 40 megatons globally. That's 0.001% of the world's greenhouse emissions. It's a technology that's shown itself to overpromise, underdeliver, and one of the real issues with carbon capture and storage in the oil and gas sector is that it ignores 80% of the problem that comes from burning the fossil fuels in our cars, in our homes, the downstream emissions.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Levin.
Thank you so much, Ms. Levin. I understand that the success in Europe in reducing GHGs has been more notable and perhaps more successful, particularly in France and the UK. There are European groups that work but have borne fruit. Solar sources of energy represent 23% and 14% for wind energy. And the other forms of energy have been spoken about, geothermic, for example. People speak publicly about the need for this type of energy, but there is a need for investors as well if we want to have this future. Over 10 years, 20% reduction would limit the reheating to 20 degrees Celsius. It seems to me, Madame Levin, that there has been examples of what success could represent. And I also think that there would be economic spin-offs as well for the future if we were to follow the lead of others.
Certainly, we really need to be investing in scaling renewable energy power here in Canada, where we are definitely below our potential in terms of the renewable energy capacity and the part of our mix that comes from renewable energy outside of hydro. And the return on investment, I mean, is enormous. Building new renewable energy power is cheaper than just running existing fossil fuel energy production. And in terms of job creation, in terms of the co-benefits, cleaner air, jobs in every community across the country, there's no question that investing in renewables is necessary. And public support is also necessary because fossil fuels have a huge incumbent advantage over the renewable energy sector. That's why we need to put public dollars behind the things we want to see. But so far, we've seen less than $2 billion over 4 years promised for the renewable energy sector. There was an investment tax credit also promised for renewable energy and batteries. We haven't seen any movement on that one, yet we're steaming ahead on the carbon capture tax credit and on continued fossil fuel subsidies.
Merci.
Thank you very much indeed. Do you know what the fears of the people who work in the renewable energies area about recycling in the industry of renewable energies? Do you know anything about their fears?
I'm not sure about the fears. Definitely recycling in all sectors, in our EVs, in our batteries, in our renewable energy. It's important that we really build the kind of circular economy approach to the solutions we want to see to minimize the environmental impact. We also have to be thoughtful about those supply chains and make sure we're not doing undue harm to communities whose land they're on.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, but it's the only way we can get everyone's questions in. So we'll go to Ms. Collins for six minutes, please.
My first question is for Ms. Levin. I'm wondering if you can respond to the suggestion that we should move away from strict definitions of subsidies and efficiency. To meet the government's international commitments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, don't we need a clearer definition of what a subsidy is, and ideally a definition that aligns with internationally agreed upon standards?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I would say that having clear definitions is helpful in terms of making sure that globally we're addressing this issue in the same way. I do take the point that sometimes we get so lost in these definitions that we miss the forest for the trees, and that can be very dangerous. So I think a simple definition is any type of public support, public funding that goes to the sector is a subsidy and has to be eliminated. My worry with inefficient is because there is no agreed upon definition for inefficient, that governments like Canada can use that as a loophole to continue subsidizing the fossil fuel sector. Countries like Italy, as you heard the other day, have just said all subsidies are inefficient. So that's one way to approach that. So I think there's a balance between making sure we have agreed upon language that doesn't let governments use weasel words to get out of real action, but also lets us have comparable targets with our peers.
Thank you so much. And kind of as a follow-up on that, you mentioned Italy, but also the UK have recently found that all fossil fuel subsidies are inefficient. As Canada is proceeding with our long overdue G20 peer review process with Argentina, what do you think Canada can learn from these conclusions?
I mean, one of the most important conclusions is just the sense of urgency. Most countries finish their peer reviews in 12 to 16 months. Canada is approaching the 4-year mark, and we still haven't seen the self-review portion, let alone when the two countries share. So really, it really exemplifies the lack of urgency with which the government has tackled this issue. And we talked about the time frame going from 2005 to 2003, but I'll remind committee members that this was a promise made in 2009. We've had a lot of time to act on it. In terms of findings, I would highlight some of the peer reviews that were done, especially the one Italy peer review, but also the U.S. and China had a peer review with a lot of. One thing is the inventorizing, but just as more important is also the reform. So looking at what the other peer reviews have put forward in terms of steps to actually reform their fossil fuels.
Thanks so much. In 2021 alone, Export Development Canada provided over $5 billion in public financing for fossil fuels. If the government is going to make good on their promise to end public financing of fossil fuels, do you have recommendations for changes for the Export Development Act?
I think we have to put in exclusionary principles within the act and go. We focused on EDC as a crown corporation, but there's so many crown corporations that are giving money to the fossil fuel sector, and the problem is no one's tracking it. This is a really onerous task that's falling on the hands of a couple of 2 or 3 people within the Canadian climate movement, and that's it. No one else is tracking this. So CDEV, TMC, there's tons of corporations. So we need legislation. What we're asking for in terms of implementing the promise that was made to phase out fossil fuel financing is a broader legislation that puts exclusionary policies in place towards any fossil fuel financing, including to oil and gas through false solutions, through gas, through CCUS, because actually just this week, EDC created a new transition bond, which is going to double down on CCUS, and that's kind of what we're seeing happen. The shift, the country realizing we can't talk about fossil fuel subsidies the way we did before, so we're just going to call them CCUS. We're just going to call it fossil hydrogen, but we're going to take the exact same amount of money and just put it to those technologies and pretend that they're not subsidies anymore. So we need policies that really address that issue.
And if you were to pick 1 or 2 subsidies that would be the top of your list for elimination, what would they be?
EDC support is by far the greatest part of Canada's, support to the sector. So putting in place exclusionary policies at Export Development Canada is a huge step. You mentioned $5 billion this year. Most years it's $13 billion. This was just a slow year for EDC. Beyond that, I would put in place, rather than individual subsidies to be eliminated, there's just so many. NRCan itself has at least 10 different funding programs. Then we have programs that aren't fossil fuel subsidies, but without strict climate conditions, might give huge amounts of subsidies to the fossil fuel sector, like the $8 billion net zero accelerator. So we need strict conditions on those, and we need binding legislation that none of these funds will go to the fossil fuel sector.
Mr. Chair, how long do I have?
45 seconds.
Okay. In today's report, you listed a number of programs that could easily become fossil fuel subsidies if green strings are not attached. Can you talk a little bit about the need to have climate conditions on government spending?
Yeah, so the big one there is the $8 billion net zero accelerator. But generally, I mean, we've been talking about the oil and gas orphan well cleanup. If that had gone just to nations, to communities to clean up their own oil and gas well, that's an excellent use of public money. The problem is the lion's share of that money went to CNRL, it went to Suncor, and they just paused their own spending, used public dollars, so there was no extra reclamation from those companies or jobs created by those companies. So there's just so many examples of the kinds of employment conditions, environmental conditions that we should be placing on these programs.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. McLean now. We're in the 5-minute round.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the witnesses for scintillating information here. I really appreciate it. Let me start off with something that I hear the witnesses focusing on here. I'm going to go to Mr. Bougin. Mr. Bougin, we talk about EDC here and the $8.6 billion in loans it's providing as an inefficient subsidy. Are loans considered a subsidy, if you will, when they are market-based?
I think it depends on the rate. If they are preferential loans that give the proponent rates that are better than they could receive in the market.
Are they preferential loans?
In some cases, yes.
How preferential?
I don't have a numerical answer to that question at my hands.
Okay. I'll move on. That being the case, they are paying interest, so you wouldn't consider it a subsidy if it was a grant as opposed to a loan? Like all the alternative energies receive, the grants and a CCA rate of 100% on the equipment they install, those wouldn't be considered comparable subsidies as a loan that actually pays interest?
I think both can be considered subsidies. It's a question of how big the subsidy is.
How big and how deep it has to go. Correct. Okay. With the $8.6 billion being paid back, would you consider, along with interest, would you consider it still a subsidy?
If the rate is better than they could receive from market value from the capital markets, then yes.
Okay, thank you. But not a deep subsidy, not $8.6 billion worth of subsidy, but maybe 1% of $8.6 billion? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
It's a fraction of the piece rather than the whole.
Good.
Yes.
No, thanks very much. So $8.6 billion is a bit of a stretched number. Would we agree?
I think it's probably smaller than that, yes.
Thank you. You talked about 90% of global GDP being committed to net zero future. Can you tell me where that 90% of global GDP that's actually committed and how it's actually performed so far as reducing greenhouse gas emissions around the world?
That comes from commitments to achieve net zero.
So like this government, it's kind of in words so far, but no actual results. In fact, negative results. They've actually grown GHG emissions in 90% of these countries.
Not all of those countries have yet implemented policies. You are correct. That being said, the risk of them acting on their commitments should be taken seriously.
Yes, I agree. The risk of them not acting on the commitments should be taken seriously, and the
risk of them acting should also be taken seriously, and the risk of them moving and committing and following through on those commitments should be taken seriously.
Okay, I'll move to Ms. Levin at this point in time because she talked about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Ms. Levin, the International Energy Agency talked about the necessity of carbon capture, utilization, and storage being a part of the 2050 goals put forward by COP26, saying that 7%, the most tangible 7% of reductions would happen with CCUS, but you're saying it's not a good subsidy, correct?
I'm saying what the IPCC scientists are also saying, that the best path to 1.5 degree future does include carbon dioxide removal, but through natural nature-based solutions and not through engineered CCUS. And certainly both the IEA and the IPCC don't allow for the lion's share of that CCUS that's in the IEA's net zero roadmap is actually for not the oil and gas sector, but sectors like cement. Some of those niche sectors that we will still need in 2050, where we don't know what other decarbonization options are there.
But we won't need energy in 2030.
Certainly we will need energy.
Okay, and all that energy is going to come from where in 2030, if I can get some kind of postulation from you?
The energy will come from a mix of renewable sources. In addition, we will have energy efficiency measures, which greatly decrease the amount of energy that is required. And a combination of those things have been modeled for countries, for the world, and in allowing us to achieve our climate targets.
Thank you. But you realize that none of this modeling actually works and hasn't worked to this point in time, when in fact we continue to consume more power everywhere around the world, including in Canada. Technology takes more power. Everything we do in society takes more power. We're going to need potentially more power in Canada, despite the fact that we're more efficient. We've become 4 times more efficient in the last 4 decades with our power consumption. We still consume more power. We're a power-intensive society. You're thinking that there's going to be that interruption?
Sorry.
You think that's going to change?
Yes,
Yes,
I think it is changing.
Okay.
There's
That's a good answer. That's a good succinct answer, Ms. Levin. Thank you. We'll go now to Ms. Thompson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Levin, if we could sort of continue on with you, certainly starting with you, and thank you to all the witnesses for coming this evening. And thank you as well for sharing the environmental defense. So in reading that, I noted actually in the executive summary, you stated the tally of how much financial support has been provided to fossil fuels by the federal government. Could you clarify if this dollar amount cites the wage subsidy, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, and the federal payments to Western provinces for oil and gas cleanup?
So the oil and gas cleanup, that was in our 2020 report and wasn't included in our 2021 report. In our 2020 report, we found $18 billion went to the oil and gas sector. And that was included because most of that money went to Suncor and CNRL, companies that have, that have targets in terms of their own cleanup work. They paused their own cleanup work. They took public dollars and they didn't do any extra work. So it was a fossil fuel subsidy. In terms of the wage subsidy, we also did include the part of the wage subsidy that went to oil and gas companies. It was a huge underestimation, though, because so little of that information is made available.
Thank you. Following the thread in the executive summary, you also stated that real climate solutions are not being properly funded. So to this end, could you just speak to sort of something that I see in my riding, and certainly with the federal government, the $100 billion spent since 2015, but in my riding of St. John's East, 2021, for example, $4.8 million federal dollars committed to low carbon economy leadership fund to support 13 climate action funds in the city. Provincial government also contributed to this. And then between 2019 2021, Clean Technology Innovation and Research Development as part of the transition funding, $51.8 million with almost $10 million from the province. Could you speak to this and these are just 2 examples, in relation to the climate solutions not being properly funded?
The $100 billion number includes a range of things that aren't actually about building climate solutions. It's a number the government throws around, but there's never any kind of documentation of the things that are in there. I would love to see a more fulsome documentation, but mostly a lot of it is infrastructure spending that isn't actually climate solution. But those investments in your community, I'm happy that they're there. I'm not saying the government has spent nothing on renewables. I'm just saying it's a fraction. For example, EDC, most countries around the world, their public financing, the ratio between fossil fuels and renewables is 2-to-1. In Canada, it's 14-to-1. I mean, we just have a tremendously bad track record in terms of support to fossil fuels instead of support to climate solutions that make everyone's lives better.
Thank you. Just want to move on with other questions, but I do want to note that it's a very broad statement that solutions are not being properly funded. It's just very broad. I want to just reference Blocking Ambition, Fossil Fuel Subsidies, Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland and Labrador 2022 report by the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Canadian provinces also spend public funds to incentivize fossil fuel development and forgo substantial uncollected royalties tax revenues. The report states that in the fiscal year 2020-2021, the government of British Columbia provided $760 $165 million in fossil fuel subsidies. Government of Alberta, $1.32 billion. Could you speak to how federal spending on fossil fuel subsidies compares to that of other levels of government? So, in other words, this is really a provincial, federal reality.
For sure, we have to phase out subsidies at both the provincial and federal level. The difference is at the federal level, a lot of the subsidies are almost all of the subsidies at the federal level are production subsidies, and at the provincial level, you have a mix of production and consumption subsidies. Not so at the federal. But I would encourage the federal government to show leadership. It's the only level of government that has made commitments around reforming fossil fuel subsidies. Though it can also lean on British Columbia because they're right now reforming their royalty regime to make sure it doesn't subsidize oil and gas. But a lot of work needs to happen at the provincial level for sure.
I just want to get another question in. I think I'll probably get.
I think you can get in a comment, but not an answer at this point.
Basically, it's the federal provincial subsidies. Indeed, can they help shift to less polluting methods or renewable energy? So, is there a capacity to also be part of the transition?
Yeah, that might have to. The answer to that might have to come at another opportunity. Madame Vignola, pour 2 minutes et demie, s'il vous plaît.
2.5 minutes, Madame Vignola. Ms. Levin, we know that Canada is 14.5% more aid for renewable energies, and these sectors of renewable energies have to emerge as quickly as possible. What regulatory or political instruments, to your mind, could see that these are well established? Should it be EDC or not? And also, can you talk to me about green funding as an opening for investors?
I mean, I think EDC has a tremendous role to play in helping emerging Canadian companies take advantage of both opportunities in Canada and internationally. It's an export credit agency, but its mandate has been really reformed to focus at domestic level. So EDC, there's a tremendous opportunity there. I would love to see tax credits made specifically for renewable energies. And the government has made important promises like the Clean Electricity Standard. We have to make sure that it's robust enough so that natural gas can't squeak in, because that would be a giant missed opportunity. But there's a lot on the table in terms of growing our renewable energy sector. We need more ambition. We need to move more quickly, and we have to make sure that the funds are there.
Merci. Si on fait l'inverse.
Thank you. If we were to do the opposite, if you just imagine that over the past 30 years, the government had put 14 times more energy into renewable energies than into oil, what would be the impacts for today, and would it be better?
It would certainly be better, without a doubt. I have to speculate on the impacts, but I imagine, better jobs. We know investments in renewable energy are just much better in terms of their the job creation potential. Cleaner air, communities that are further along that have more control of their own energy sources. There's just really countless benefits. If we had taken the opportunity, 20 years ago, we have to start today. This is still a reality that we can get to if we work hard.
Pardon.
10 seconds, Madame.
10 seconds. How much does pollution cost in terms of health care and so on yearly? Do you have a round figure to put forward, Ms. Levin?
I have a number that was put forward by the Canadian Medical Health Association 5 years ago, and it was $53 billion each year in health costs because of burning fossil fuels.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, to Ms. Levin, Canada's biggest emitters are paying the lowest carbon tax rate, contributing only 1/14 of the full carbon price. And oil and gas companies are currently making record profits. Shouldn't these companies be paying the price of their own pollution?
Thank you so much for that question. One thing we had in our report was a case study of Suncor to quantify the level of subsidy that through exemptions and carbon pricing. Suncor should have paid $880 million in 2020 based on the amount of carbon pollution they had, they only paid $59. That's a $770 million subsidy for one company. And that doesn't even count their downstream pollution. So really what we need to be doing is urgently fixing the carbon pricing regime so that it actually applies to all of the emissions from the oil and gas sector. And really that's what we don't need, a CCUS investment tax credit. We need a carbon pricing system that works.
Thanks so much. So clearly these carbon tax loopholes are a fossil fuel subsidy.
Yes, they are. Just no one's been able to quantify them because it's a really onerous task. We leaned on the work of CICC to get some of our numbers, but it's an enormous fossil fuel subsidy. It's a tax break.
Great. And so would you support, I'm assuming you would, but would you support legislation with a formal and binding commitment not to introduce any new fossil fuel subsidies? And are there other paths forward that you see?
We're calling for exactly that, a binding commitment, since this is, we're 13 years in and we've seen very little action on this. We also, need those green strings. We need, and we need, in addition to that, there's also these, we haven't talked about TMX. Canceling TMX would be, that's one of the most egregious examples of fossil fuel subsidy that exists in Canada. But yes, a binding commitment is certainly what we're calling for.
Great. And why are the subsidies for decarbonization of fossil fuel production both environmentally and economically dangerous?
When they go to oil and gas companies, there's this notion, and Minister Wilkinson has said this a lot, that if you're paying an oil and gas company to decrease their emissions, it's not a fossil fuel subsidy. And that just, it's confusing to me. That is, lowering their cost of business. It's leaving them with more profits that we see what they do with those profits. They give them to shareholders and to CEOs and bonuses. And there's this false dichotomy that you can, you can pay a company for this and not this. And
thank you.
So,
thanks very much. Thanks. Mr. Carey for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. I come from Oshawa, and in Oshawa we have quite an auto industry, history anyway. We have had some challenges recently, but General Motors has invested again in our community. And part of that historically has been assistance from the government. And one of the things perhaps I would like to ask maybe Madame Levin, how do the subsidies in the oil and gas sector compare to subsidies and support in other sectors such as agriculture? Manufacturing, things like that. Canada does tend to have certain advantages just because of our resource sector and our people, and we do tend to support those sectors. How would you say these subsidies compare to support in other sectors?
Fossil fuels, the oil and gas sector is the most subsidized sector. I can't compare it to fertilizer and manufacturing because no one's done the work of documenting those subsidies. And this speaks to the lack of transparency. I mean, we do the work of documenting fossil fuel subsidies as an ENGO, but the government doesn't do it, and they don't do it for any of their sectors. So it's very hard to make those comparisons.
Well, interesting as far as, our world role and our place in the world. I know with the automotive sector, one of the reasons the government has different tools in their toolbox is to allow us to be competitive internationally. And sometimes because of different policy reasons, it may be very expensive to do business in Canada versus other parts of the world. And when we're looking at one of our natural advantages, such as fossil fuels, Canada could be providing the world with cleaner, relatively speaking, sources of energy, which we are going to be needing into the future. But we may not be able to do it competitively if we don't have these different tools in the toolboxes. So if we give up these subsidies and other countries don't, how do you think that's going to affect the overall greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels around the world if Canada is destroying our own industry, but other countries decide not to do that in the same way?
I'm banking on countries actually, taking climate change seriously. Canada's a laggard. We're not a leader on this. But more generally, Canada has the dirtiest oil in the world, the fourth dirtiest in the world. And this This came through in the ERP, this idea that we could have the cleanest and most competitive oil, but like that doesn't play out in reality. The technologies that exist to lower emissions exist everywhere. There's this magical thinking that only Canada will be able to slightly clean up our oil, and that just, it doesn't bear out in reality. We know that our oil, because it is among the dirtiest and the most expensive, it's the first that will get left behind in the energy transition. So the question is, do we bury our head in the sand and pretend it isn't happening? Or do we take care of the communities and the workers who are dependent on the sector today and make sure that when the sector collapses, that they aren't left behind? Will we repeat what we did with COD, or will we learn from that?
Well, I don't think burying our heads in the sand in any way is what any politicians around this table want to do. But we do want to make sure that Canadians are able to put food on the table, and that we're not basically cutting off our own future, where other countries, and China, India, Brazil, some of these other countries may not be going that same route. I did want to ask a question as well, because Mr. Buffalo, I think, was very enlightening when he said that some of these things that are being called subsidies are actually programs that benefit different communities, particularly his community. And sadly, there doesn't appear to have been proper consultation with Indigenous communities in regards to listing these different subsidies. And I was wondering if perhaps, Madame Levin, you could comment on that. Do you think that's the right approach to be taking?
25 seconds, please.
I think it's incredibly important that we don't take away subsidies that give energy security to Indigenous nations, but to put that in context, out of the $18 billion, it was $3 million. I would say that $3 million should stay. Out of the $8.6 billion, it was $2 million. That $2 million should stay. But that's not what most of what we're talking about. I would support more money to helping Indigenous communities transition, develop whatever the decision making and that nation wants to do.
Thank you. Mr. Weiler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to also thank the witnesses for joining today. My first question I'd like to ask to Mr. Bujan. You've been very complimentary as carbon pricing as the most efficient tool to reduce emissions. And for Canada to do more and to do faster in reducing emissions, as our Minister of Environment and Climate Change has said, from our largest and fastest source and growing source of emissions, do you see a role for government to support reducing emissions on top of what would be feasible through regulations alone?
Just to be clear, this is additional support in addition to carbon pricing and regulations?
That's exactly it, yeah.
I think carbon pricing and flexible regulation should be the backbone of a cost-effective policy that will minimize costs to achieve deep emissions reductions. That being said, there are things that carbon pricing doesn't do. It doesn't provide necessarily full support to innovation and research and development, and there's a case for subsidies there. It doesn't provide infrastructure, incentives to build infrastructure that private individual firms might not build, but all of them together can work more efficiently. All of those things create room for additional support. Information, providing additional certainty about long-term carbon prices, perhaps through support from the Canada Infrastructure Bank. All of these kind of complementary policies can make carbon pricing work even better, both in terms of effectiveness in reducing emissions and in cost effectiveness of minimizing costs.
Thanks for that. One of the other points you made in your opening was that Canada should maximize scarce public dollars for investing in, or sorry, to make tough choices investing in areas with scarce public funds. And one of the areas that you mentioned in this is a sector could thrive in a low carbon future, which is in hydrogen. So I was hoping you could speak to the opportunities that you see in hydrogen, both from blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, and how you see those competing over time.
Yeah, both could play significant roles on pathways to net zero to 2030 and went on to 2050, and both should be part of the playbook. Ideally, policy is less technology prescriptive rather than more. It lets the market determine where there are most cost-effective opportunities to reduce emissions and contribute economic growth. So options should be kept open, absolutely, with respect to both. That doesn't mean they will necessarily play out and they will necessarily evolve into game-changing technologies, but they very well might, both domestically and in international markets that are going to be increasingly demanding low-carbon fuels.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask my next question of Ms. Levin. You made the point earlier on that we need to electrify our economy and invest in renewable energy. And these are, of course, some of the things that they're already doing through the Pan-Canadian Framework and the Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy strategy, and of course the ERP that was just announced yesterday. And these are a lot of the low-hanging fruit that we really need to focus on. But there's going to be a point where we'll have harvested all of those low-hanging fruit, and it's not going to get us all the way to net zero. So I was wondering if you see a role for government to invest in R&D, in moonshot technologies and other pilots that may not bear fruit right away, but down the road could be critical for, not only for Canada, but also for other countries to have deep decarbonization.
I certainly do. We do need to have R&D in areas that are, not going to play a role in the next 10 years, but will later on. But I will say, like, those low-hanging fruit parts of the equation, that's 80% of our emissions. That will take us a lot of the way there, and then some extra R&D into some of the areas that might play a role. It just shouldn't go to the companies that are fueling the climate crisis.
And well, in the report that Environmental Defense released earlier today was very, very critical of CCUS. And there's all types of different applications of carbon capture. And one that I was curious if you could speak on Environmental Defense position on is the role of direct air capture, both in terms of not only reducing emissions that are currently here, but also reducing legacy emissions that have already been emitted.
20 seconds, please.
We should be doing R&D, but we shouldn't be making climate plans assuming that will pay off, and it shouldn't be oil and gas companies doing the R&D. But NRCan has $400 million to do that. We have said if the tax credit just doesn't go to, is only for cement or some of these R&D purposes, that's okay to go ahead as well.
Well, I want to thank our witnesses for a very stimulating discussion. One could say debate, and I know that everyone's testimony is going to contribute very much to the report that we will be writing at the end of this study. So thank you very much. We're going to pause for a moment so that we can connect virtually with the witnesses for the second panel. Again, thank you. Merci à tous et à toutes pour.
Thank you to everyone for your being here with us to share your perspectives on the issue at hand. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you again in another context. So we'll have a brief pause here to connect with our next panel of witnesses.
Get going with, excuse me, the almonds here are salty. We'll go to our second panel, and we have two witnesses. We have, as an individual, David Gurham, and from the Macdonald Laurier Institute, Dr. Heather Exner-Pirot, who's a senior policy analyst. So we'll turn to Mr. Gurham for 3 minutes, and then followed by Dr. Exner-Pirot, and we'll dive right into questions after that. So go ahead, Mr. Gurham.
Thank you. I'm going to speak about proposed subsidies and tax credits to support CCUS in the oil sands. I invite the committee to examine the plan in the context of Canada's climate predicament. We need deep reductions nationally and globally within the next 9 years. Our ability to make essential cuts by 2030 should be the decisive criteria for this committee's study of CCUS. An objective of CCUS deployment is to facilitate continued expansion of oil production for another 10 years and maintain high production levels through to 2050. But CCUS can only decarbonize the production process inside Canada. Those emissions represent less than 15% of emissions associated with every barrel we produce. The other 85% occur after our exported oil is burned as fuel and the emissions are released as tailpipe emissions. Those downstream emissions from our exported oil cannot be removed from the atmosphere once they are released. Direct air removal technologies do not exist. The fact that we do not count them does not halt the warming. The IEA's Net Zero by 2050 report warns to have a realistic chance of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees, global consumption must decline 25% by 2030, 50% by 2040, 75% by 2050. In contradiction to that, the CER's new evolving policy scenario shows Canada's oil production will continue increasing until 2032. CER has refused to examine what future pathways of oil production in Canada would be consistent with staying within 1.5 degrees. The IPCC 2018 report found all releases of CO2 must reach net zero by 2050 to give us a chance of meeting the 1.5 goal. That's trite. We are all talking about that. A second crucial finding was that in order to achieve net zero by 2050, annual global emissions must be reduced 50% by 2030. The unforgiving 2030 deadline is explained by the rising atmospheric carbon concentration level. It tracks the rising amount of CO2 in the upper atmosphere that is driving the heating of the Earth. The recorded level for 2020 was 413.2 CO2, 3.2 ppm CO2. It is now rising at an average rate of 2.5 ppm every year. To stay within the 1.5 warming threshold, the carbon concentration level must be kept below 430 ppm. At the present rate of increase, it will exceed 430 by 2028. Our government says Canada has no legal responsibility to count our downstream emissions as part of our national emissions. But the accounting rules are not an answer to the problem we face. The downstream emissions from our oil are a core problem. They contribute directly to climate change in Canada to the same extent as if those emissions were released in Saskatchewan or Nova Scotia. Emissions from our exported oil will contribute directly to climate breakdown will contribute directly to climate breakdown in BC and northern Quebec. This catastrophic outcome, which crosses all national boundaries, is being driven by the physics of climate change.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gooderham. We'll have to stop there. We're a bit over time.
That's fine.
But there'll be opportunities to speak in response to questions. We'll go now to Dr. Exner-Pirot.
Thank you, Chair and committee members, for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm speaking from the territory of the Tsuut'ina Nation outside of Calgary. For my remarks, I want to focus on 3 issues that I believe have been missing from the public debate on eliminating inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Not only do we have to define a subsidy, we also have to define what we mean by fossil fuels, because at their essence, they are hydrocarbons and an incredibly accessible and versatile molecule with many uses that are critical to our modern way of life and living: textiles, rubber, digital devices, packaging, detergents, plastics, carbon fiber, medical equipment, and fertilizer. In terms of the energy transition, they are also essential in the production of solar panels, wind turbine blades, batteries, thermal insulation for buildings, and electric vehicle parts. Demand for petrochemicals is booming, and the IEA expects it to account for over a third of the growth in oil demand to 2030. Invest Alberta, a Crown corporation, believes there's potential for the Alberta petrochemical industry alone to be worth $30 billion a year by 2030. In addition to petrochemicals, ammonia and blue hydrogen are also derived from natural gas, a fossil fuel, and a consensus is emerging that ammonia and hydrogen will play a key role in the energy transition. When used with carbon capture, it can produce very few emissions and is an excellent low carbon energy solution. It can be produced more cheaply in Alberta than any jurisdiction in the world, which is important because it needs to be cost competitive to compete with oil and gas and trigger the demand that will help achieve that critical mass of infrastructure for hydrogen. So I would tell you that it's imperative that any efforts you have to develop fossil fuel subsidies focuses on activities that burn fossil fuels rather than conflating it with use of hydrocarbons in general. That relates to the second point. If the intent of the commitment is to eliminate fossil fuels is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then public supports for research and projects aimed at reducing GHGs should obviously not be included, even if those supports go to oil and gas companies. I note the opposition in the CCUS investment tax credit that the previous panel had discussed. Helping the highest emitting sector in the country to reduce their emissions faster seems highly aligned, not in contradiction of Canada's COP26 and G20 climate commitments. Punishing the oil and gas sector is not more important than reducing GHGs. We need to be fighting a climate war, not a culture war. Finally, I would like to highlight that despite recent COP26 commitments, the current energy crisis has spurred governments from all over the world, including in Canada, to provide subsidies and tax credits to gasoline prices, heating bills, and energy costs, measures that fall perfectly into definitions of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But they have been implemented because affordable energy is fundamental to our collective well-being and development. Almost every human development indicator is positively correlated to energy use per capita, from child mortality to literacy to gender equality. And if it's bad in Canada, you know that it's far, far worse in the developing nations around the world. So it is not easy to paint fossil fuel subsidies with a negative brush, and some nuance needs to be applied. In many cases, it is to help the most vulnerable in our societies have some access to energy, and it is a human right. And this committee should be mindful of the role we have in ensuring every Canadian has access to reliable and affordable energy. I'll stop my remarks there.
Thank you very much. So before we go on to the questions, I would just like to mention that Grand Chief Phillips was going to be with us today, but was unfortunately unable to make it in the end. So what we will do is, we will append his opening statement to the evidence once it's translated, and it will be considered for the report, obviously. Okay, so we'll start with Mr. Seaback's joined us. So Mr. Seaback, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Dr. Exner-Perot, I really enjoyed your comment with respect to, we need a climate war, not a culture war. And some of the things we've heard at the committee today and that you heard and we heard at previous committees is trying to say that virtually any type of tax credit that an oil and gas company is able to use is a subsidy and therefore it's bad. I was wondering if you could just perhaps point out some of the tax credits that are being attacked as subsidies that actually serve a pretty useful purpose in actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, the one I'm most familiar with, because I do a lot of work on Indigenous economic development, is the one that Mr. Buffalo referred to, which was the site rehabilitation program. And as he said, they are a shining success. It has reduced methane. It created jobs. It created economic opportunity for First Nations in Alberta and Saskatchewan, including in Ontario. Some of the money actually went to cleaning up some wells in Ontario on reserve from the 1860s around petroleum. I believe the town is called Petroleum on Ontario. So again, the idea that just because a tax credit goes to an oil and gas company makes it bad when it's, such a huge part of our economy. And the idea that you can have this transition without including the oil and gas sector with the expertise that they have in pipelines. When pipelines aren't filled with oil and natural gas, they're going to have to be filled with hydrogen. We're still going to need to have pipelines, and we're still going to need to have this expertise in how you bring energy to, billions of customers. So removing the fossil fuel sector from the Canadian economy is not a realistic or desirable proposition for the climate or the economy.
So I'm just going to try and give you an example, and I don't actually know if there's a tax credit available for this, but for example, using natural gas as a transition fuel. Right now, there's two steel plants in Ontario that are removing most of the coal in their operation and transitioning to natural gas. It's going to save 3 megatons each per year. That's 6 megatons. That's a huge reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. If there were a tax credit for that, would you consider it to be one of these subsidies that we should absolutely get rid of?
I mean, I'm not the only subsidies I think we should get rid of. Should be subsidies. We should have a much stricter definition of that. But things that promote burning of fossil fuels, not things that promote eliminating greenhouse gases. I think we're missing the forest from the trees, I think, in some of the public discussion that we've had and that I heard in the last panel.
Thanks very much. Mr. Gooderham, you're talking about oil and gas. We only account for 15% of emissions, and you say 85% is downstream tailpipe. Are you suggesting that when we calculate emissions in Canada, we should include those tailpipe emissions?
I don't think that's just an accounting. You could do it, and obviously it could be in the official numbers. The whole point of my submission is the fact that we don't count the downstream emissions is not a reason that we should not pay careful attention to the implications of our increasing oil production. Because for every, if you will, 15 units of emissions that we generate in Canada in the production process and might collect through the CCUS, there's 85 units that's being released somewhere else in Shanghai.
So should we not export oil? Should Canada stop all oil exports?
Well, first of all, what I'm saying is you have to weigh the downstream emissions in making the policy decisions about what Canada does with increasing production. And I would say that the answer is we should stop increasing production because those downstream emissions are going to cause immense suffering, whether we're counting them or not. So you should take them into account.
But wouldn't that oil production just be picked up from somewhere else in the world? You talk about it's global. So,
yes,
if Canada that's actually trying to use things like carbon capture, utilization, and storage with these kind of tax credits to actually lower the amount, why would we not want to give that and say, well, other countries produce oil. It's your responsibility then to try and take out some of that carbon because we're just not going to produce it and hope that someone does a better job.
Well, first of all, if we eliminated, say, half of our upstream emissions, we're eliminating 7% of the emissions we're putting into the atmosphere from our oil production, which is negligible given the crisis we're facing. As to the point about carbon leakage, which is you're saying if we don't do it, somebody else will.
There's no carbon dome over Canada.
Just a minute. 20 years ago, we might have said, let's not do anything until we get an agreement with many other countries. So we'll all agree to reduce our oil at the rate is necessary to avoid a catastrophic outcome. But we didn't do that. Now, my point in my opening is we have 9 years left to very, very sharply turn the curve down on global emissions. We're a big contributor to that. So that to now say, we better not do this because if we do it, somebody else will produce, that's essentially a suicide march. So what I'm saying to you
is, we should invest in things that are going to lower the oil and gas emissions here in Canada because the demand for oil is there. So if we're not producing it, someone else will. So why don't we produce it in a way that's going to reduce the actual emissions from producing it?
Because
we hope someone else does.
Okay, we're going to have to go to Mr. Dogood for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. Great discussion this evening. And just to put on the record, Mr. Speaker, in the Liberal platform, which I'm sure you memorized, Mr. Chair, on the campaign trail, there is reference in the document to EDC being refocused to be the largest clean technology financier in Canada. I'm fascinated with this discussion on CCUS. We have ANGOs like the Pembina Institute that are actually partnering with oil and gas to support CCUS, and we have other ANGOs who are seemingly quite opposed. And my question is to Ms. Exner-Pirot, and by the way, I'm a fellow University of Calgary graduate,
and lived in that community for some years. But I think in your view, CCUS is a work in progress, can be viewed as investing in R&D, research in development, with some promise to make industries like blue hydrogen possible without carbon capture and underground storage. Blue hydrogen would not be possible, is my understanding. And I wonder if you would comment on the 45Q tax credit in the U.S. and how it is driving CCUS and whether it has been successful south of the border.
Thank you very much for the question. So we heard in the last panel that, the time has already passed for CCUS, and I think that couldn't be further from the truth. But if Canada is a laggard in anything, it's in investing in carbon capture. And we've already seen Norway investing in carbon capture. In fact, they're providing a straight out subsidy, paying for 2/3 of the cost of carbon capture and utilization strategy, with industry only paying 1/3 of the cost, because Norway is so committed to reducing those greenhouse gas emissions. And in the United States, as you mentioned, the Section 45Q tax credit, it was introduced back in 2008 and reformed in 2018. So they have a lot of experience with it. It has jump-started numerous CCUS projects, and now even has bipartisan support to expand it. And we know how hard it is to get bipartisan support for anything in Washington. The major difference with the 45Q tax credit is that it also supports tax credits for enhanced oil recovery. And that's obviously the most economic, and from an industry perspective, the most attractive tax credit. And so if anything, I would say Canada and the Liberals' plan, although good, to introduce this tax credit for CCUS doesn't go far enough if we're really concerned about the emissions. And as the last MP noted, someone else is producing it if Canada isn't producing. So let's make it as clean as possible in Canada. When you also do...
If I could squeeze one more question in, because I'm sharing my time with Ms. May. So as the price on pollution goes up to $170 a ton, 2030, it would make carbon capture and underground storage even more competitive. Would you agree with that statement?
Enhanced oil recovery is already competitive, because what it does is I'm getting a bit of a feedback. I don't know if it's me.
Yeah, I'm not talking for extraction purposes. I'm talking about for storing carbon.
Yeah, and actually Canada has tremendous geological potential for storage. So again, we're blessed with so many natural resources. We're also blessed with the ability to store carbon effectively.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. May, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and particularly thank you, Terry Duguid. My questions are to Mr. Gooderham, because I think I know what you're talking about when you say we have 9 years, but I'm not sure we have a shared fact set around the table about why you say 9 years. So I'm just going to run through some numbers and ask for you to speak to the question of opportunity cost when I finish this. It's the IPCC October 2018 special report on 1.5 degrees that specifically says there's only one way that we hold to 1.5 degrees, and that's deep cuts this decade on the order of 50% below 2010 levels by 2030. And that's a quite unforgiving number. And the IPCC has said if we fail, the window will close permanently. So if we get to net zero by 2050, it'll be too little too late. We will have exceeded potentially 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and so on. So my question to you is, in terms of carbon budgets and the unforgiving nature of the physics of the atmosphere, if we put our money into fossil fuel subsidies, what do you see as an opportunity cost, particularly if it's a technology like carbon capture and storage, which has failed to meet its targets in countries around the world? What does it do to our chances of being able to survive on the planet into the next half of the century?
You have about 40 seconds, Mr. Gooderham.
Well, I'll just focus on the case of carbon capture and storage is being put forward here to allow us to continue to increase production and allow us to reduce upstream emissions. And what I'm saying is if we're going to increase production, we are going to miss the 2050 target. There's no doubt about that. We're a major supplier, and if other countries do it as well, we're going to miss it. So, and I pointed out that the current carbon concentration level is 413. It's going up at 2.5 a year. And once we clear 428, there goes 430. We've passed the 1.5 limit. And when we cross 450, we passed the 2 degrees limit. And that'll happen by 2035 at the rate we're going. We're just talking around this issue, but this is, in fact, the thing that's going to kill us.
Thank you. Madame Vignola.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, Madame Exner-Perrot, could you send to the clerk data on the information you've referenced and the source of the information, and Mr. You could to allow us to deal with these questions. Mr. Goodenham, I'm going to give you some time to finish the idea that you started to outline with us, with my previous colleague, Mr. Seaback. So 1 minute for you, and then I'll move on my questions.
All right. Well, the point I was seeking to make is that I understand the carbon leakage argument. I've been following it like all of you have for the past 12 or 15 years. We never managed to negotiate any agreement with other countries to stop increasing. And in fact, we massively increased our production. And now we have, in effect, 9 years left to achieve a 50% reduction. There is no argument about that. That's the science. We're not going to be able to do that if we continue increasing oil. It's absolutely clear we won't. Therefore, at this moment, to say, well, if we stop producing more oil, other countries will just keep producing it, cannot be a sufficient answer because it is suicidal. Therefore, we stop increasing our production and we start trying to get other countries like Norway and England to agree to do that. And we then move to tariffs and other systems to block out oil from countries that are continuing to increase. We either do that or we are killing our children.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Goodenham.
Thank you, Mr. Goodenham. I understand that we should set the example, the good example in terms of reduction. My next question, the Canada Energy Board published a scenario about 2021 in a scenario that dealt with an 18% rise up until 2032 and with a 23% drop, 1.26. Mr. Laissé, who's a climate expert, asked the Prime Minister to be sure that the board would be able to support and defend those scenarios. But we're still waiting to hear about the scenarios in detail. So I know that there is a modeling of a future that in no way deals with the commitments that Canada has made. So what do you think about this situation?
The national energy, the Canadian energy regulator, as it's now called, its report on November 24 was decisive because it was the report that embraced, for example, this great commitment to net zero and relying on carbon capture and storage. And it's a lengthy report, which we all read. Now, it put forward something called the evolving scenario. You'll be familiar with it, which was an alternate, slightly lower level of oil production for Canada, but still substantial increase. It then observed explicitly in its report that even that scenario would not get us to net zero, would not keep us within 1.5. But it did not go on to tell us what kind of trajectory for oil production for Canada would do that. That was in November 2020. In July 2021, about 24 of Canada's leading energy economists and experts on climate called on the CER to develop a scenario that would tell us that would align itself with the IEA's net zero scenario for oil production. It would be a line going down like that to some degree. But again, the CER issued a report on December 9 of this past year, which again ignored, it didn't tell us what that scenario might be. Now, the minister finally, about December 21st, if you will, directed the CER to proceed and do that modeling, but we still don't have it. So I put it to you, put it to the committee, that how can, and you're calling the government to account in Parliament, how can the government be setting these major plans, like planning to increase oil production, but at the same time do massive carbon capture and storage, without us knowing what kind of trajectory for our oil production would be consistent with staying within 1.5 degrees? We just don't know.
Yes, but why are they doing that? Why are they taking so long to reflect on solutions that are so important for future generations? What is slowing them down?
Well, I mean, I can't answer that better than you can, but I've watched the NEB, which it's the same organization. In 2016, they did the upstream emissions, the inquiry into the TMX pipeline, which essentially was the key pipeline project that would commit us to this growth we're now seeing in oil production. There was an opportunity in 2016 to have the NEB examine whether the projected increase in Canada's oil supply could be consistent with a 1.5 degrees target. But the NEB and the Liberal government at the time could have directed the NEB to do that.
Okay, thank you.
But
we'll go to Ms.
it didn't do
Collins,
that.
who may invite you to continue your line of thinking, but that's her decision.
I do have some questions for you, and the Liberal government is spending nearly 2.5 times the amount on Trans Mountain Pipeline as it is on its climate plan that it just unveiled this week. The government continues to kick the can down the road, subsidizing unproven carbon capture technology instead of investing in renewables. We heard a report that the government has subsidized fossil fuels at 14 times than renewable energy projects. Would you agree that subsidies targeted to reduce emissions in the fossil fuel industry would be better directed to help fund the renewable energy transition? And can you give a frank assessment of what this government has done over the past 6 years and the direction that it's headed now?
Well, I certainly think the subsidies should be withdrawn from the industry. And I think concurrently with that, I think that the applicable carbon price under the output-based system should be substantially increased. And then we will begin to see a decline in our production. We have the tools to do it. The Supreme Court of Canada has said that the federal government has that power. There's no reason why the carbon price on oil, why the performance standards is set at such an absurdly high level that they pay a carbon price on a fraction of their emissions. And that's just the upstream emissions. So we have the tools. Remove the subsidies, save for helping with transition of communities, and accept that this industry now has to go into a declining trajectory, however gentle that may be. So that's my answer to your question. Remove the subsidies.
Thank you so much. And so just to follow up on that, Canada's biggest emitters are paying the lowest carbon tax rate. So it's about 1/14 of the full carbon price. And so just maybe a quick yes or no, you would consider that a fossil fuel subsidy?
Oh, definitely. It's a subsidy by any measure.
Great. And what policies and funding measures would help accelerate the development of clean, renewable energy initiatives?
Well, that's really beyond, I don't have an expertise in that. But what I do know from having watched this for the past 10 or 15 years is that we have, particularly in Alberta, we have the wind and solar opportunity to have the biggest clean energy industry in North America. So I think that we've got the incumbent industries have got a stranglehold on the policy process. And to illustrate that, I will point out that when the CCUS thing emerged about 12 months ago, it didn't emerge in a government policy statement. It emerged in the pages of the Financial Times and Bloomberg and newspapers, the financial sections, reporting on interviews that their CEOs were giving. And then our government responds through other newspaper interviews and say, oh, we'll sit down and talk to them about a $75 million subsidy program, billion-dollar subsidy program. There's still not a government document that makes a case for carbon capture and storage, either on the emissions basis or any other. It's all coming from the industry.
Thank you so much. In 2020, Export Development Canada provided $5 billion in loan renewals for financing for the construction of Trans Mountain Pipeline. Do you think that amendments to the Export Development Canada Act need to be made? And if so, do you have a sense of what they would? And also in order to be consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People?
Well, on the rights of the Indigenous people, I might say that the big thing that's impacting on the rights of the Indigenous people is the TMX pipeline itself. And we've heard much crocodile tears on this about not consulting with Aboriginal groups about taking away opportunities to develop the oil industry. But the brazen lack of consultation on the TMX pipeline was a major error. And so I think that that pipeline should have ceased when it was no longer commercially viable, as that was clear back in 2018. And it's now clear if we look at the CER's own evolving scenarios now for oil production, they themselves admit that by 2032, when our peak production arises, that pipeline TMX will be surplus capacity.
Thank you so much. And just you had mentioned the IPCC has put a target of 50% globally that we need to reduce our emissions in order to ensure a livable planet. Can you comment on the adequacy or inadequacy of the government's current target?
Well, the target, having read the report 2 days ago, it looks like they've got a target of a 40% reduction. Pretty sketchy. It actually hasn't advanced much since the December 11, 2021, 2020 numbers, which were very similar. They're still promising, in the case of the oil and gas sector, now an incredible 80 million ton reduction of emissions by 2030 below the current level. That simply cannot be accounted for. There's no way carbon capture storage on that level is going to be in operation by 2030. It's a fantasy.
Thank you. I hate to stop you there, Mr. Gooderham, but we now go to the second round, the 5-minute round, and Mr. McLean will kick it off.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And Madame Exner-Poro, I'd really like to hear more about the comparability of the 45Q regime in the U.S. versus what we are proposing here in Canada, either enhanced oil recovery or not. Can you tell us that if the 45Q includes enhanced oil recovery in the United States?
I can tell you, this isn't my area of expertise. Energy security and global energy demand is an Indigenous resource development. But I can tell you that, yes, it includes enhanced oil recovery. And I assume you know that there are very good environmental reasons in terms of land impact to do enhanced oil recovery.
Well, thank you. Can you elaborate further on the flow of funds for research and development and the technology jobs associated with that have migrated from Canada to the United States since 2018 when they came up with the 45Q regime to develop technologies to enhance the carbon capture technology they use now in the United States?
I wouldn't have the specifics. You probably have the specifics in front of you. But as you're very familiar, there has been an outflow of foreign direct investment out of Canada for oil and gas, for mining that we need for critical minerals, for everything because of our very long and arduous regulatory system. And we need all those things to make renewables also. So we need to reconsider all the things that we do to attract foreign direct investment here.
Okay. Are you familiar with the amount of funds, government and corporate funds, that have invested in developing this technology over the last decade in Western Canada?
No, I'm not, but I'd love to hear it.
It is billions of dollars, as we've said, and it is both public funds from the Government of Canada, the Government of Alberta, the Government of Saskatchewan, and it does capture significant carbon. It is some of the best carbon capture technologies around the world. And we do represent a large portion of carbon capture sinks in the world in Canada as a result of commitment from both public sector and private sector organizations in Canada. So thank you for the opportunity to ask that. As far as economic viability goes of the sector, if we continue to give more economic benefit to a neighboring jurisdiction in the United States because they're giving better economic programs to make sure that producing companies can continue to provide an energy benefit to their citizens, while at the same time developing technology that captures carbon and provides other environmental benefits to the world, do you think those companies will migrate elsewhere? Sorry, that's a long-winded question.
No, well, we've already seen it. And I think that's the key of this question is that Canada doesn't operate in a bubble and the oil and gas industry doesn't operate in a bubble. And if we think it's a fantasy that we're not going to have carbon capture in 9 years, then let me tell you about the fantasy of reducing global, demand for oil and gas in the next 9 years. So yes, are we better off? Do we believe that Canada has better ESG performance than Russia, than Iran, than Venezuela, and indeed the United States? I mean, and by objective measures, we do. And so the question is, do we want to have some control over how that gets produced and how it gets exported? Not only on the environmental side, which shouldn't be the government's only consideration, but obviously on the social and governance side, which we've seen become such an issue in the last 2 months, then absolutely we should be encouraging investment in Canada.
And I have another question. I was over at the International Energy Agency meetings last week, and Australia made it very clear that in the last decade, OECD countries, the most developed countries in the world, have decreased their share of fossil fuels as a percentage of their energy mix from 79% to 77.9%. So a reduction of 1.1% of their energy production from fossil fuels over a decade. So as Australia would say in that point, it is time to actually look at how we decarbonize this sector as efficiently as possible and as quickly as possible, as opposed to continuing to tilt towards other unfeasible solutions at this point in time. Any comment there, Ms. Sexton-Poore?
Absolutely. It's even worse than that because we're having an energy crisis right now. People have not had the natural gas, the LNG that they would have used instead. And actually coal production is reaching record highs ever in history. And emissions this year are reaching record highs. And so the unintended consequences of saying that LNG is not a perfect solution, so we can't use it at all, not only produce war, not only has fertilizer prices at the highest that they've been in history and creating, food insecurity and famine, but also created coal production to go up and emissions to go up and set us back in that respect by several years.
Thank you. Mr. Longfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses and for, as the chair said, a good debate that we're having within committee. The clerk is keeping notes, and I'm sure we'll be able to sort this out at the report stage. But some of the numbers, like $9 billion that we've just topped up, that was in addition to $100 billion that we had previously spent. I mean, some of the numbers that are out there, I think, are fairly misleading this evening. But I want to go back to some of the basics with Dr. Exner-Pirot on market dynamics that create the need for subsidies. When markets are early in their development, the only way to scale and to get through the valley of death is through some external force or funding, quite often from federal governments, and that's done around the world. Could you maybe discuss the dynamics that we're in right now in terms of the transition into cleaner versions of what we're doing? And also when we might remove the need for subsidies, as we're saying right now, inefficient subsidies to be removed by 2023. The price of oil is increasing again. The market should be able to handle some of its own investments. Could you comment on that?
I can. I favor small government. And so when the oil and gas industry is making record-breaking profits, I think that they should be paying for a lot of the things themselves. There's no reason for the taxpayer to subsidize that. But on things like carbon capture, where it is a new untested technology, where there are large upfront costs, where competitors in the oil and gas world elsewhere aren't doing carbon capture and aren't reducing the methane the way we are. So when you're asking the Canadian oil and gas industry to do something at a higher standard at a more expensive level that makes their production more expensive and thus less competitive, that's when I think there's a role for the public sector to step in.
Terrific. And I can think of some parallel situations in mining when we were fighting the ozone layer. Nobody could afford the scrubbers that went onto the stacks. The global market had to come to some kind of conclusion on that. But in the meantime, we had to put some money into those solutions. The result was we solved the ozone layer crisis back in the 80s.
Absolutely. And things like electric vehicles. Yes, it makes sense to subsidize chargers at this point. We can all agree with that. So it's got to make sense on the greenhouse gas emission efforts also.
Thank you. And I was listening to Mr. Carey's questions and also thinking in Ontario, the automotive industry has had subsidies to get us into the position where all of the major manufacturers are now going to EVs or going to zero emission vehicles productions. That would not have happened with the market forces alone, given the low demand of those units. And now we're in a position to lead in that market. There's a parallel in Alberta.
Yes, and I will say a lot of what they have described as subsidies was basically getting the oil and gas industry through that rough 6 months in 2020 when COVID, when oil and gas prices did go negative, and helped them stay afloat in that short period. And now obviously they've been able to pay back those loans. Those aren't the cheapest loans. It'd be the first ones that want to get off their balance sheet. But there was a good role of government in providing those loan guarantees in that exceptional black swan period.
Right, and the commercial results will come, and then some of those loans will be repaid, and some of them with different terms, which could be then determined to be an inefficient subsidy. But that's something that we need an international definition on subsidy, because we are in a global market. So the importance of Canada working with Argentina to try to come with some type of definition that all global producers can agree on.
Absolutely. And again, I would just have to warn you that it should focus on consumption of fossil fuels for burning it, for enhancing greenhouse gas emissions, and not for using the magical molecule of hydrocarbon in so many other ways that it, positively impacts our lives.
Great, thank you. And on the complexity of this, we're also working on a cap. What is the cap going to look like? I know that the government is in discussions federally. We're working with the provinces and with the people that are involved with setting carbon pricing in the different provinces and territories to get to a cap on this. What's your view on caps?
Yeah, in the G7, they just announced last week, Prime Minister Trudeau, that we call on oil and gas producing countries to act in a responsible manner and increase deliveries to international markets. We can't have a cap on emissions and without resulting in a cap on production. And guess what? The new development that cap would impose is on LNG and blue hydrogen, because the oil sands are already producing. So it's, from an environmental perspective, it makes no sense.
Okay, thanks. We'll go to Madame Vignola.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Ms. Exner. Pirot, I'd like you to send through the clerk the sources of information that you have cited about production with my colleague, Mr. McLean, a few moments ago. Mr. Goodham, very quickly, the appetite for carbon capture has grown enormously over the past years, and particularly in the oil and LNG sectors where they are just thirsty. We've heard a great deal around this table since the beginning of the evening's discussion, but could you give me any figures about the state of failure of carbon capture? And if you can't, perhaps you could do so in writing and send it to the clerk.
Yes, I would be happy to do that. I have filed a submission with you but on that question, I will supplement it. I will note, however, that we mustn't overlook that in Alberta between 2008 and 2014, there was an immense program to develop carbon capture. And the plan was, in the published plan, was to reduce emissions by 139 million tons by 2050 using carbon capture. The program was abandoned in 2014 because the Alberta government of the day said that it was a science experiment and uneconomical, and the NDP government agreed. So that was the end of it. We have in Alberta, the only survivors of that immense program is the Quest project and one other. Quest captures 1.5 million tons. The government's recently boasted it captured 4 million tons between the time it was completed in 2015 and 2019. 4 million tons. In that time, the cumulative emissions, upstream emissions in the oil sands were 300 million tons. So it captured a little over 1%. So to say that we have a lot of carbon capture in Canada, with respect, is an unfounded statement. We have the Boundary Dam in Alberta. And as far as the build out of this, nobody, I don't, seriously informed on this will suggest that by 2030, we're going to be capturing maybe 20 million tons in Alberta at most.
Thank you. We'll go now to Ms. Collins.
Well, it's a bit of a follow-up on that question. You've said that the objective of carbon capture and storage is to facilitate the continued expansion of oil production and maintain high production levels through 2050. In the government's recently tabled plan, they're forecasting 22% increase in production over the next 8 years. They've also recently announced 300,000 barrels a day increase in production. You've also pointed out that that level of production is incompatible with keeping to 1.5 degrees and avoiding catastrophic climate change. We heard from a previous witness that carbon capture technologies have so far only captured a fraction of a percent of Canada's GHG emissions, and that's despite the billions of dollars in subsidies. You mentioned Alberta's example. Can you speak a little bit more about the current carbon capture technology and really on the government's reliance on this?
Well, it actually has very little. Several major projects were canceled in the States at coal sites a couple of years ago because they were simply uneconomical. There are, of course, longstanding projects in Algeria, one in the North Sea done by Norway. But the IEA back in 2013 was expressing its disappointment that carbon capture and storage had not been picked up around the world. And it still hasn't. So the reason is the cost. And we had in Alberta had a huge investigation or study in 2015. It was published in May 2015 by the Canadian Association of Academics. It was about 15 engineers who knew the oil sands. And their conclusion, 2015, was that carbon capture would never play a significant role in reducing emissions in the oil sands. Why? Because it's too expensive. And then they went on and they explained in more detail. Part of the problem is you can build a new project, greenfield project, possibly that would have some economics to it. But to renovate old projects is a major expense, and that's most of the production in Alberta. And the other problem was that the in situ production, which is now the typical production in Alberta, the economies of scale are too small to justify carbon capture.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll go now to Mr. Dreeshen for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, and it's been an interesting evening. I'm so thankful, Ms. Exner-Pirot, that you did talk about hydrocarbons, because everyone talks about fossil fuels as though they understand what that's all about. But the reality is that what is coming out of the ground is something that is used in so many different areas. It is the plastics that we have. It is the fertilizers that we have. All of these types of things, any products that we see around these tables are part of that. And and I was speaking with the head of Dow Chemical in Red Deer not that long ago, and he was pointing out, and I mentioned this before, that in a windmill there's 17 tons of material. 7 tons of that is plastic. So to think that you can just shut off the main feedstock that we have and that is going to allow us to come up with these magical ideas, I really find it difficult to sort my way through that. But the question that I'd like to pose, if we take a look at uranium, which of course is an energy source, if we look at all of the rare earth minerals that are going to be required for batteries, if we come up with some magical new product to replace this 40% of plastics that I said would be in windmills, and if that happens to be found on your land, or if it happens to be found on Indigenous property, or if the people around here, if it happened to be in their own riding, I'm just wondering if we could trust this government to give us the license to develop, corridors to transport, and access to markets, or will these new projects be met with the same scorn as we see with oil and gas? What do you think the future would be for any kind of development in Canada?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that, we absolutely need a low carbon transition. That carbon transition will change from the exploitation of fossil fuels to the exploitation of minerals. And that is so well known. So the critical minerals that we need for transmission lines, for EV batteries, for the generators, for the magnets, everything that goes into making the sun, into actual electricity that we can dispatch to a consumer requires critical minerals. And, in some of the minerals like lithium, we need 10 or 12 times the mining that we're doing right now. In others, copper 3 or 4 times. So overall, our production of minerals in the world, we can't have a transition until those mines get built. That takes 10 to 15 years, and that, and they're an affordable rate that we can start to buy it. So we have to make mining more affordable. We have to be able to get more product to market. We have to, enhance our supply chains. And guess what? The fact that we're in an energy crisis and oil and gas costs more means that everything in that mineral supply chain is also going to be more expensive. So the first time after a decade, we're seeing solar panels cost more, and we're seeing electric vehicle batteries cost more. Tesla 3 is a third of the price, third more than it was a year ago.
Well, thank you. And of course, when we do talk about windmills and solar panels or any of the other type of renewable projects that might come on stream, of course, the question then becomes, are we going to demonize those people that are shareholders in a similar way as we are demonizing the oil and gas companies, and eventually say, well, these guys are making way too much money, so we should be taxing them as well. You start doing that, they're going to either go to other countries and leave us in the lurch, or they'll start bringing in products from other places in order to keep the costs down. So I'm just curious if you could discuss that, and when we ever can expect some sanity to return to this discussion.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Let me just stop the watch there. Yeah,
and so sorry to interrupt my colleague. Just that it is 8:30, and I'm curious what time we're planning on ending this.
We have one questioner, Ms. Taylor Roy, after, and then we're done.
Okay. I have a very hungry baby that needs breastfeeding very quickly, so I'm just hoping that we can...
At least you've had your turn. You've had your questions.
Wrap up as quickly as possible.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I will just say that in terms of energy security, right now, China controls a quarter of our mining production. Russia controls another 9%. So we absolutely need to ramp up critical mineral supply chain with our allies in Canada. They're going to be looking to Canada to provide those minerals for this renewable energy transition. And so absolutely wanting to incentivize and make it as easy and make it as quick for us to get mines up and running in Canada is imperative to have this low carbon transition in a safe way that doesn't just change, Russia's geopolitical leverage over to China.
That's fine.
We'll go finally, last but not least, Ms. Taylor Roy. Ms. Taylor Roy,
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'd like to actually share my time with Elizabeth May.
Starting when? After what minute mark?
I'm sorry?
Starting now?
No, starting now.
Okay, Ms. May?
No, she may have left. Okay, then I will proceed. If I thought she was there. So for Mr. Gooderham, I've been listening to the debate, and clearly there's two sides, very different sides to this story. But what you've been telling us about 9 years and the need for a quick transition, I look back and listen to the story of CCUS that was underway 10, 15 years ago in Alberta, and a lot of the other initiatives that have been taken. What do you think it's going to take to get us to move more quickly in the direction we need to go? Because we've been talking about it for a long time. And I understand, Ms. Exner-Pirot, what you're saying about the need to do this in a methodical way. And I don't disagree, but it seems to me we're running out of time. So how would you respond to that, Mr. Gooderham?
Well, that's the great vexing question. I mean, it's the heart of our extraordinary dilemma we're in. I might say that nobody's saying shut down all oil in the next year, but we're talking 25% in terms of global production down by 2030. And I can only say that I think that until people can, if you will, pause and move away from the debates of, is this a subsidy, is that a subsidy, and this industry and all that, and recognize the fundamental constraint facing us. And I'm going to put it to you in this way, that the children who are now 6 years old, 5 and 6 years old, and we all know some of those, by the time they're in grade 8, it's going to be too late for them, too late to reverse this path we're on. That's how bad it is. And I put it in that way because I think that conveys the absolute desperation of where we are now. And we're here in this situation because we didn't act 15 years ago, 10 years ago. So I hope that I cannot think of a better way to answer your question.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Exner-Pirot, what is your response to that?
So for many people in the developing world, that terrible future is today because of inflation, because of high energy costs, because of high food prices. In fact, according to the FAO, the food price index is
No, I'm
as
sorry.
high.
I only have 1 minute, Ms. Exner-Pirot. So I understand cost of living considerations, but people in the developing...
So there's famine now because of fertilizer prices, because of the energy crisis. So we need to consider about the humans of today as well.
But also because of drought and because of extreme climate crisis. And actually, some of the developing countries are the ones that are suffering most from climate change, although they haven't contributed to it. So I'm asking about climate change in particular.
Yeah, and all of these issues are tied up together. I agree climate is a very important issue, and I agree the energy crisis is a very important issue. And I don't think we should ignore one at the expense of the other.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, do I have any time left, Mr. Chair?
Yes, you have about a minute and a half.
Okay, Elizabeth, did you want to ask another question? I was offering to share my time with you.
On mute, Ms. May.
Thank you so much. I foolishly took off my headset because I didn't think I'd get another chance. But if you're willing, I just want to get back to the questions that I was pursuing earlier with Mr. Gooderham about timelines and urgency. Because if we had all the time in the world, we could look at lots of different options. But the unforgiving thing is the timeline to 2030. And I'd like some final thoughts from Mr. Gooderham, if we could.
All right. Well, I did send you a submission that has a section on it about the rising atmospheric carbon concentration level. We can talk about this in terms of carbon budgets and other ways, but the most immediate way to look at it is what is that atmospheric level at? Because that is what is driving the heating. And that's well understood and well documented, yet never discussed in any of the Canadian government's reports. As I said, it was 413 in 2020. It used to be going up at about 0.3 a year back in the 1990s. It's now going up at 2.5 a year. We know that by 2028, it's going to be above 430. 430 atmospheric carbon concentration level is the line at which, unless we have amazing technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere later, we will irrevocably have risen above the 1.5 line.
Do you mind if I put in another reference point that for the last roughly million years, it was never above 280 parts per million.
Yes.
So going above 413 this year and being at 1.1 degree global average temperature increase already should make us rather more motivated.
Yes,
And
and that brings our meeting to its conclusion. A fascinating discussion in both panels, very vigorous and well-articulated points of view that help us define and clarify the issues that we are studying. Thank you very much to both witnesses for your articulate presentations and answers. And on that, I will adjourn the meeting, and we'll see each other next Tuesday at the usual time, 11 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you.